The first thing I saw when the shaking stopped was a crack running straight through the ceiling above me. Jagged, gray, spreading like a fault line across the drywall, and I remember thinking, that wasn't there before. Then my daughter screamed. Not a tantrum scream. Not the kind she does when her brother takes her crayon. This was something raw and animal, the kind of sound that bypasses your brain entirely and goes straight to your chest. I was on my feet before I even registered moving, stumbling through the lobby of the office building, past overturned chairs and shattered glass, and a potted ficus lying on its side like it had just given up. Lena was pressed against the wall near the elevator bank, 6 years old and burning up. I'd checked her temperature in the car before we came in, 103.2, and my husband had said bring her along anyway because it was just a quick stop, just 10 minutes. Her face was flushed and slick with sweat, and she was crying so hard she couldn't catch her breath. I pulled her into my arms. I've got you. Mama's here. I've got you. The building groaned. Somewhere above us, something heavy shifted. That was when I saw him. My husband was 20 feet away on the other side of the lobby. He had his assistant by the waist. She'd twisted her ankle, I'd learn later. A mild sprain, nothing that required stitches or surgery or a hospital stay, and he was guiding her toward the main exit with a focus and urgency I had never once seen him direct at me. Not when I was in labor for 16 hours. Not when I had my appendix out. Not ever. He didn't look back. I stood there holding my feverish child, glass crunching under my shoes, the ceiling still groaning overhead, and I watched my husband walk out of that building with another woman like we didn't exist. I should back up. My name is Sylvia. I'm 38 years old. I grew up in Asheville, North Carolina, the only daughter of a man named Harlan Beaumont. Though if you've ever read the financial section of any major newspaper in the last 30 years, you might know him by his company, Beaumont Capital. My father built it from nothing after my grandfather lost everything in the 80s real estate collapse. He swore he'd never let that happen to his family again, and he didn't. By the time I was in high school, we had a house in Asheville, a condo in Charlotte, and a standing reservation at a restaurant in Charleston that my mother liked. I tell you all this not to brag. I tell you because it matters later. I met my husband. I'll call him my husband because that's what he was, even if the word sits in my mouth now like something I want to spit out. At a conference in Atlanta 9 years ago. He was charming in that particular way that men without money can be charming. Completely focused on you, asking the right questions, laughing at exactly the right moments. His name was Rex. He was working middle management at a logistics firm and driving a Civic with a cracked dashboard, and none of that mattered to me because I was 29 and I thought I was in love. My father was polite at the wedding. He shook Rex's hand and said, "Take care of my daughter," in a tone that contained multitudes. Rex heard it as a pleasantry. My father meant every word. We moved to Portland, Oregon, which was Rex's city, Rex's choice. I'd been working remotely anyway, consulting for a nonprofit my father had co-funded. So it wasn't hard logistically, it was hard in other ways. I was far from everyone I knew, in a city that took years to crack open, married to a man I was slowly realizing I'd invented in my head. Don't get me wrong, the first few years were good, or good enough. We bought a house in the Laurelhurst neighborhood. We had Lena. Rex got a better job, then a better one after that. I told myself the distance I felt was just the exhaustion of new parenthood, the adjustment of marriage, the ordinary friction of two people making a life together. Then he hired a new assistant. Her name was Petra. I noticed things in increments, the way you notice a slow leak. Not all at once, but in accumulation. Rex started staying later at the office. He started closing the laptop when I walked into the room. He started buying new clothes without mentioning it, coming home smelling faintly of something that wasn't his usual soap. When I asked him about Petra once, casually, he said, "She's great, really sharp," in a tone that was too careful, too neutral. The verbal equivalent of someone trying not to react. I filed that away. I want to be clear. I didn't have proof. I had instinct, and a history of telling myself I was being paranoid, and a 6-year-old with chronic ear infections who took up most of my bandwidth. So I didn't push. I just watched and waited and told myself I was wrong. The day of the earthquake, Lena had been running a fever for 2 days. It wasn't the flu. Her pediatrician thought it was a viral thing, just needed to run its course. But she was miserable, clingy, and wouldn't sleep unless she was pressed against me. Rex had a meeting he said he couldn't miss. I said I'd bring Lena along, set her up in the lobby with her tablet and a blanket, while I handled some paperwork at the shared office space where I rented a desk twice a week. It would take 30 minutes, tops. Then we'd go home, do soup, do movies, do the whole sick day routine. We never made it to the desk. The earthquake hit at 11:14 in the morning. A 6.1 centered about 40 miles south, which doesn't sound catastrophic until you're standing inside a 15-story building and feel the ground do something the ground is not supposed to do. People always say earthquakes sound like a truck. This one sounded like the building itself was cracking open from the inside. I grabbed Lena and got under the desk nearest to me. We held on. The shaking lasted maybe 30 seconds. 30 seconds is a very long time when your child is burning with fever and sobbing into your neck, and you don't know if the ceiling is going to come down. When it stopped, I assessed. Lena was scared but not hurt. I had a cut on my forearm. I hadn't even felt it happen. That was bleeding more than it should have been. The lobby was a mess. A section of the drop ceiling had come down in the northwest corner, one of the large windows had cracked straight through, and there was plastered dust everywhere. The building was intact but clearly compromised. I looked for Rex. He was there. He was fine. He was standing next to Petra, who was sitting on the floor with one hand braced on the wall and the other cradling her foot, making a face like someone had stepped on her. Then, I saw him make a decision. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't announce itself. He just slipped his arm around her waist, said something low near her ear, and started moving her toward the exit. One careful step at a time. Focused. Present. Tender in a way that, I want to say it clearly so you understand, I had not seen directed at me in years. He looked at me once, across the distance of the lobby. Just a glance. Then he looked away and kept walking. The door closed behind them. I carried Lena out of that building myself. My arm had soaked through my sleeve by the time we reached the sidewalk. The street outside was chaos. Car alarms, a distant siren, people standing in clumps talking on their phones from the building facade scattered across the concrete. I sat Lena down on a low retaining wall and pressed my hand against the cut and looked for Rex. His car was gone. I called him. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I called him again, same. I texted, "Where are you?" "Lena is with me. I'm bleeding." "Where did you go?" I stood on that sidewalk for 11 minutes. I know because I checked my phone 4 times, waiting for him to respond or come back or send some signal that he remembered. He had a wife and a sick child in the building he'd just walked out of. Lena had stopped crying by then and had gone quiet in that specific way children go quiet when they feel worse, not better. An EMT from one of the response units that arrived waved me over when she saw my arm. She cleaned the cut, taped a pressure bandage on it, and told me I'd need stitches. A real doctor, a real numbing agent, the whole thing. The cut was about 4 inches long and deep enough that she was brisk and efficient and wouldn't let me argue. "Where's your husband?" she asked. The way people ask when they assume there is one nearby. "I don't know," I said. She looked at me for a beat longer than necessary. Then she wrote down the address of the nearest urgent care that had sent a message saying it was operational, pressed it into my hand and moved on to the next person. Rex finally texted back 40 minutes later. "At the hospital with Petra. Ankle might be broken. You guys okay?" I read it twice. 3 words he could have sent. "Where are you?" And instead I got a status update on Petra's ankle. I drove Lena to the urgent care with one arm, 7 stitches. Not 4 inches, more like 5.5 when they cleaned it properly. They gave me a tetanus shot, a prescription for antibiotics in case of infection, and a sheet of aftercare instructions. The PA who treated me said I needed to rest. Keep the arm elevated, watch for signs of infection. I drove home, gave Lena her fever reducer, got her settled on the couch with her stuffed rabbit and the animated show she liked, and sat in the kitchen while my arm throbbed and thought very clearly about what had just happened. Not the earthquake, not the stitches. The decision. The moment I'd watched my husband make a choice and learned, without any ambiguity, exactly where I ranked. Rex came home around 6 that evening. He'd been at the hospital with Petra. The ankle was a sprain, as it turned out, nothing broken, wrap in ice and stay off it. And then he'd, in his words, wanted to make sure she got home okay. There was traffic. He'd lost track of time. He said he was sorry about my arm. He sounded like a person saying they were sorry about a parking ticket. I looked at him standing in my kitchen in his good jacket, fine and uninjured and apparently satisfied with himself, and I said, very evenly, "Lena had a 103 fever and I drove her to urgent care with a bleeding arm that needed stitches, and you were making sure your assistant got home okay." He opened his mouth. I said, "Don't." He shut it. There was a long silence. The refrigerator hummed. Lena's show played from the living room, some cheerful theme song that felt absurd against the particular quality of the silence in that kitchen. Rex said, "You're blowing this out of proportion." "Am I?" Petra was hurt and I was already with her when the earthquake hit. What was I supposed to do? "Come back," I said. "Come back into the building for your child." He looked at the floor. Then he said, "You were fine." "I didn't know I was fine." "You didn't know I was fine. You left without checking." He said something about stress and adrenaline and how people make decisions in crisis that don't reflect their priorities. He was very articulate about it. He used the word instinct twice. I went upstairs, got into the shower, and sat on the floor of it for a while with the water as hot as it would go. In the days that followed, Rex seemed to expect things to return to normal. He came home on time, made dinner twice, asked how my arm felt. He was performing attentiveness the way people perform fluency in a language they actually don't speak very well. Technically correct in the broad strokes but hollow, in a way that's hard to pin down. I had my stitches checked. I called Lena's pediatrician. I did the ordinary things. And I called my father. I didn't tell him everything at first. I gave him the factual version: earthquake, I was hurt. Rex had been with his assistant, Lena was okay. My father listened without interrupting, which is unusual for him. When I finished, there was a pause. He said, "Are you telling me what I think you're telling me?" I said, "I'm telling you the facts." Another pause. Then, "I'll be there Friday." I said he didn't have to do that. He said, "I know." My father arrived in Portland on a Friday afternoon. He's 71 years old. He still wears suits every day. Not like he's trying, just like it's the default setting he was installed with. He had a meeting in Seattle that morning and rerouted. He didn't fly commercial. He never flies commercial for anything under 4 hours if he can help it. Rex was home when my father's car pulled up. A hired car, nothing ostentatious, just clean and black and driven by someone who appeared to operate specifically in my father's orbit. Rex watched from the living room window with an expression I couldn't entirely read. My father came inside, kissed my forehead, crouched down and spent 5 minutes talking to Lena about her stuffed rabbit, as though nothing else in the world mattered, and then stood up and looked at Rex. "Why don't you and I talk?" my father said. It was not phrased as a question. I don't know everything that was said. My father has never told me the full conversation and I've never pressed, because I have a sense that some of it was the kind of thing that doesn't survive being repeated. What I know is that it lasted 40 minutes. What I know is that Rex came upstairs afterward and said he was going to stay at a hotel for a few days to give us space. What I know is that when I came down later, my father was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee he'd made himself, looking entirely calm. I sat across from him. He said, "You're going to be okay." I said, "I know." He said, "I mean legally, financially, all of it." I've already called Evelyn. Evelyn Marsh, the most effective family law attorney in Portland, who had done Rex's own company's legal work twice, and therefore had an intimate understanding of exactly how his finances were structured. My father had apparently been paying her a very comfortable retainer for 3 years, just in case. When I asked him about that, when had he started that retainer, he said, "After the wedding." I stared at him. He shrugged in a way that said, "I raised you. I know how these things go," and sipped his coffee. What followed was not a single dramatic moment. That's the thing about real life versus stories. The actual reckoning happens in documents, in conference rooms, in a series of emails that your attorney sends while you're making your daughter's lunch, or sitting in carpool. The confrontation you imagine, the one where you say the perfect thing and watch someone realize the full weight of what they've done, mostly doesn't happen. Or it happens quietly. On a Tuesday, when a financial disclosure lands on your desk and Rex realizes for the first time that he'd spent 9 years underestimating who he'd married and where she came from. He had co-mingled quite a lot over the years. My father's attorneys, plural, because Evelyn brought in 2 others, were very thorough. There was a deposition. There were several weeks of back and forth that I mostly experienced secondhand, through Evelyn's measured updates delivered via email. There was a moment when Rex's attorney apparently asked whether my father would be willing to settle certain matters quietly, and Evelyn relayed my father's response as, he declined to comment on that proposal. My father's declining to comment on proposals is, I have come to understand, a negotiating position. Lena's fever broke on a Saturday, 8 days after the earthquake. She came downstairs asking for waffles and wanting to know if we could get a hamster. And I stood in my kitchen watching her, and felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized had been tight. I won't tell you the final numbers. That's not really the point, and anyway it's private. What I'll tell you is that I walked out of that marriage with the Laurelhurst house, with primary custody, with a settlement that Rex's attorney described to Evelyn as more than fair, in a tone that apparently suggested he felt otherwise. I'll tell you that Petra resigned from Rex's company shortly afterward. I don't know the details and I didn't ask, because she's not the point, and she never was. The marriage had been failing long before Petra. She was just the thing that made the fact impossible to ignore. The earthquake cracked the ceiling, and the marriage, and something in me that had been trying very hard to hold a particular shape. I let it all fall apart. And then, more slowly and more quietly than any story makes it sound, I put together something better. My father was back in Asheville by the following Monday. Before he left, he came and found me in the backyard where I was sitting on the steps watching Lena draw with sidewalk chalk. She was in her pajamas still, drawing what she called a map of the whole world, which appeared to consist of 5 circles and a sun. He sat next to me. Neither of us said anything for a while. Then he said, "You know, I never worried about whether you'd be okay." I said, "That's not true. You flew up here in 2 days." "I came because I wanted to," he said. "Not because I was worried. There's a difference." I thought about that. "I was the one who was worried," I said. "I know." He nodded. "That's because you're the one who was inside it. From the outside, it was always obvious." He didn't say obvious how. He didn't need to. He kissed my forehead again when his car arrived. He crouched down one more time to tell Lena the map was X and that the large circle was clearly the Pacific Ocean. She told him he was wrong and it was Texas, and he laughed. A real laugh, surprised out of him, and got in the car. I'm standing in my kitchen on a Wednesday morning 8 months later, making coffee. The light comes in sideways through the east window this time of year and hits the counter in a way I have come to love. This particular autumn gold that lasts about 20 minutes before the angle changes. Lena is upstairs doing the slow-motion process of getting ready for school, which involves a great deal of deliberation about socks. My arm healed clean. The scar is thinner than I expected. About 3 inches visible now, running from my inner forearm toward my elbow, pale against my skin. I sometimes catch myself looking at it the way you look at something that used to mean one thing and now means something else entirely. My phone buzzes. It's Evelyn. A final confirmation on a document that's been pending for 6 weeks, something mundane and administrative, the last of the last things. I read it, reply with 2 words, and set the phone face down on the counter. Upstairs, Lena yells that she can't find her backpack, which is almost certainly in exactly the place it always is. "Check by the door," I call. A pause. Then, "Oh." I fill my mug and stands a good light for a moment, just standing, just breathing. Not performing anything for anyone. Not holding any particular shape. The ceiling above me is solid and unmarked and entirely mine.